Hey guys, my name is Miss Pannone, and today I'm going to do a mini lesson with you guys on punctuation with quotation marks when using outside sources. So previous to this, you guys did some paragraphs where you were writing and using quotes from outside sources. And when I was looking over them, there was about 7 common mistakes that I saw. So we're going to go over 7 different rules, and then we're going to take a look back at those paragraphs that we wrote and fix some of those mistakes. All right, so the first 3 rules we're going to be looking at are dialogue rules. So the first one is, with dialogue, punctuation goes inside the quotation marks. So let's look at an example. So in this example it says, punctuating quotation marks correctly is fun, said Miss Pannone. You will be good at it before you know it. So here we have our comma inside our quotation mark, and then we also have our exclamation point in our quotation mark. So we always want to make sure that our punctuation goes inside of the quotation marks when we're talking about dialogue. Number 2, if the quote is interrupted by a tagline, use commas on both sides of the tagline and 2 sets of quotation marks. So when we say tagline, we mean the introduction to whatever quote we're using, okay? So we want to use commas on both sides of that tagline to set and 2 sets of quotation marks. So an example, punctuating quotation marks, comma, said Miss Pannone, comma, is an important skill to remember. So punctuating quotation marks is interrupted by Miss Pannone, and then followed through with is an important skill to remember. So you have your quotation mark your comma inside of your quotation mark, and then another comma introducing your next set of quotations. And then just a reminder, we also have our period inside of our quotation marks. Dialogue rule number 3. If the quote begins a new sentence, use a capital letter at the beginning of the quote with a comma after the tagline. So let's look at an example. According to SpongeBob, the best time to wear a striped sweater is all the time. Here we have our capital T because it's starting a new sentence. And we also have our comma, which is introducing the quotation. And then just a friendly reminder about rule number 1 again, your period is inside the quotation marks because it's still dialogue. Whoops. All right. Moving on to question mark rules. So when we use questions, these are general rules that we want to follow. So rule number 4, if the whole sentence is a question, the question mark goes on the outside of the quotation mark. All right, so an example would be, can we agree with SpongeBob when he says the best time to wear a striped sweater is all the time? And the question mark is outside of the outside of the quotation mark because the entire thing is a question. And then again, we have a comma that's introducing our quote and a capital T because it's a full sentence. Rule number 5, if the sentence begins or ends with a tagline and the posed question is only in the quotation marks, the question mark goes on the outside of the quotation marks. So here's an example. May I have a bite? Asked Sally. So the question is only in the quotation marks and then is followed by a tagline and a period. And just so you can see it flipped, Sally eyed his lunch as she asked, may I have a bite? So again, question is only in the quotation marks, so the question mark goes in the quotation marks. That is a tongue twister. All right, moving on. Oh, sorry, there we have our question mark inside the quotation marks, question mark inside the quotation marks. All right, moving on to in-text citations. Rule number 6, when an in-text citation is used, punctuation goes on the outside of the quote instead of the inside. You've got this. All right, so here's your example. Not all writing goes well, even for experienced writers. Kirby and Krovitz, 22. All right, so because the entire thing is a direct quote from a text, the period goes on the outside of the quotation marks after the in-text citation, okay? So there's our period. It's on the outside of the quotation marks after the in-text citation. Notice that there's no punctuation inside the quotation marks because it's a direct quote. Instead, it's at the end, all right? Rule number 7, this is the last one. Oops, don't know why that happened. All right, when there is a quote inside of another quote, use a single quote mark, in other words, the apostrophe key on a keyboard, for the internal quote. So here's your example. In writing about the trusting classroom, Applebaum says that a teacher must, to a certain degree, make him or herself vulnerable to students. Moore, 348. All right, so our period goes on the outside of the entire quote because it's a direct quote, like rule number 6 told us. And then we use a single quote mark for the internal quote. So we have our first quote, which is in writing about the trusting classroom, Applebaum says. That's our first quote. That's the major quote. And then the quote inside is a teacher must, to a certain degree, make him or herself vulnerable to students. So you have the one single quote mark to signify the quote inside the quote. All right? So those are our 7 major rules that I saw kind of some common mistakes when I was looking over our paragraphs. So what we're going to do now is it's your turn. So first I'm going to hand back your paragraph, so stay where you are. And then, using the rules we just covered, I want you to revise your paragraph to reflect proper punctuation with quotation marks. Make sure to indicate the rule that you're using, all right? And then those who didn't have any mistakes, I still want you to reflect on this mini lesson. So in 1 to 2 sentences, I want you to identify the rule you used correctly and reflect on how you knew it was the correct punctuation for the quote you used. All right, so that's what we're going to start on.